Hi everyone. So this video lesson is going to be centered around talking about the role that ethos plays in establishing credibility in arguments and what that looks like. So to do that, I'm going to be discussing Bryan Stevenson's TED Talk that you all watched for your discussion board posts this week. So I originally created this presentation slash lesson for a synchronous class meeting that we were supposed to have tomorrow, but that's a wellness holiday. And so there's going to be a lot of questions on these slides that I've listed that unfortunately aren't going to be ones that we talk about together synchronously. But at any point, I do want you to feel free to pause the video, think about those questions in relation to the TED Talk that you watched and your discussion board post answers, and to feel free to talk more about this with me in office hours. So also, if you see my eyes verting to the right, I'm looking at my notes to make sure that this video can be as short and sweet as possible. So let's start with an overview of the appeals before we jump into ethos specifically. So you've probably heard of the rhetorical triangle before in these appeals, but for a brief overview before we narrow down our focus to ethos, let's run through these. So ethos, of course, appeals to the credibility of the rhetor and thus their argument. Logos appeals to the reason in their argument. So is it reasonable and probable, the rationality of their argument? And then pathos, which is the appeal to the audience's emotions and feelings, whether that's bodily, emotionally, or morally. So the Carolina rhetoric says, we are persuadable because we believe, we think, and we feel. And what that means is that we need to invoke all three of these appeals into our argument to craft a strong, persuadable argument and really connect with our audience. So two guiding questions I want us to think about going forward are, how does ethos specifically work together with the other two appeals, pathos and logos, to make an argument effective? And how might ethos balance the use of pathos and logos, since we typically think of those things, feelings and cool, rational logic, as being opposite of one another? So another important thing to think about is that the Carolina rhetoric explains we need these three things to effectively establish ethos. So these are the definitions from the Carolina rhetoric, but to put them more simply, virtue to start with is essentially you as the rhetor want to establish that you're a good person. And this can seem complicated because that seems like a very subjective thing. But what this really means is that you're being conscious of what your audience thinks of you and how they're going to judge you in your role in this argument, and you as the speaker. So this depends on a variety of factors such as your identity, who your audience is, where in the world you are, what setting you're speaking in, etc. And these are all going to vary and be specific to your argument. So you'll want to think about these things when you're crafting your argument to make sure that you're addressing them, and ensuring that you're invoking virtue in yourself as the rhetor of your argument. The second is goodwill, which is essentially the connection you establish between you and your audience. So in other words, this is that the argument extends beyond just you, that it's not a one-sided argument in the sense that you're trying to persuade this invisible or imaginary audience. Instead, you are very much focused on why this issue is important to others besides just yourself and your opinion. So the third and final one is practical wisdom. So this has to do with what we discussed last week when we discussed approaching your topic broadly and holistically and establishing the various positions and stances at hand before explaining where you stand in that argument. So basically, you want to show that you did your homework and that you did your research on this instead of making it very obvious that you approach this with a closed mind and a biased perspective. So if you can tell, these kind of all, in a sense, circle back to and connect with the three appeals that we just went over. So where have you seen or assessed ethos in this class so far? So I asked this question because we've primarily discussed ethos in terms of evaluating the credibility of sources like you've done in your ILPs and like you did for your annotated bibliography that you submitted a few weeks ago. But I want to take a step back and think about how to think of ethos in terms of establishing your argument. So in other words, how will you establish ethos beyond your use of sources? How will you individually and apart from the sources that you use, establish your credibility, not just as a rhetor, but the credibility of the specific argument that you're making that extends beyond what your sources are saying. So I had you all watch Bryan Stevenson's TED Talk for two reasons. One is that one of the things you have to do for this assignment is incorporate a non-text based source. And I know this can seem confusing or difficult since when we think of credible arguments, we tend to think of written, published scholarly sources or credible popular press sources. We don't often think of videos. So how can a verbal speech like this TED Talk establish ethos and make a very effective and strong argument without just listing off a bunch of sources? The second reason is that Stevenson does an incredible job of doing this very thing and answering these questions. So he establishes ethos in his argument without relying solely on statistics and data, right? His TED Talk isn't him up there saying, this is an issue, this is my argument, and it's not like he's reading off an essay. The way that he delivers this argument is very different from one that we would typically see written in a popular press or a scholarly source. So I think this does a really good job of kind of allowing us to think about ethos in a way that is multimodal and think about arguments in a way that is multimodal. So some questions that I had you think about for your discussion board post, were these. So what is Stevenson's main argument? How does Stevenson appeal to ethos in this talk? In other words, how does he establish himself as a credible rhetor? And I wanted you to elaborate a bit further on how ethos works in Stevenson's argument. So thinking back to virtue, goodwill, and practical wisdom. And then I wanted to think about the Carolina rhetoric distinguishes between two different kinds of ethos. So we have situated ethos, which is the reputation the rhetor already has with the audience. And then we have invented ethos, which is the reputation that the rhetor creates for that particular argument. So I wanted us to think about which ethos do we see in Stevenson's argument, situated or invented. So I want to start with question 2 and 3. So I'm going to switch to the slide for a second, just so that we're not distracted by those questions. So how does Stevenson appeal to ethos in this talk and how he establishes himself as a credible rhetor? Well, we can certainly see practical wisdom at play when Stevenson does cite various statistics and research that he's done on how the US prison system disproportionately affects people of color and the injustice that is embedded in the system and how we aren't doing anything about it. So he discusses this very rationally and logically, and he invokes this powerful analogy at one point about imagining a world in which Germany systematically executes citizens who are disproportionately Jewish. And he does this to show that he's not only done his research by invoking all of these different statistics and going and speaking at these conferences, but also that he has rationally developed a stance. So he's taking his stance on this issue in the US and using this analogy to explain the almost objective rationality of his stance on the injustice that's taking place. But the most powerful elements of ethos in his argument is the way that he invokes virtue and goodwill. So using personal anecdotes about his grandmother and how she helped him establish the importance of identity in him as a young person and what your values are, how your actions all are connected and say something about your identity, is how he values justice and committing himself to the process of truth and reconciliation so that he can help those that aren't receiving justice. So using these personal anecdotes to then explain who he is as a person. So we can establish him and think of him as a good person because he appeals to values that we all do or at least claim to have, which are caring for others and seeking justice. So where does goodwill come in? And remember, I'll switch back here really quick. Goodwill is caring about the audience and relating that you as a rhetor have their interests in mind. So this circles us back to Stevenson's main argument that our identity is at risk, both our individual and national identity. So Surprisingly, Stevenson's argument is less focused on persuading us to believe that our prison system is flawed, systematically racist, and needs to be reformed, partially because this is factually true, as he explains and uses as a defense of his argument when he goes over some of the research that he's done and the experiences that he's had. But also, it focuses more on why we need to care about it and why it's so important that we do if we expect anything to change. So, in other words, when we read the title, we need to talk about an injustice. The injustice isn't only the injustice of the prison system, but it's the injustice of our silence. So, the core of this argument is very much about goodwill, about connecting this argument that he's making to us, the audience, speaking directly to us. So Stevenson cares about us and our identity, and his argument has us in mind as well as those he's advocating for, which is the disadvantaged and those facing injustice. So, what's surprising about his reliance on goodwill is that these are just a few of Stevenson's credentials. So, for instance, he's a graduate of Harvard University with a master's in public policy and a JD from the School of Law. He's an Aronson Family Professor of Criminal Justice at NYU Law. He's executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, which does the work that he talked about in this TED Talk, which is supporting and giving defense to those condemned prisoners, juvenile offenders, etc., people wrongly convicted of crimes and thus subject to the injustice of the prison system. Has published multiple novels that have won awards, honorary degrees from multiple Ivy League universities, etc. And I bring this up because these are just a few of Stevenson's credentials. And by reading these and listening to his talk, it's very apparent that this is a fiercely intelligent, incredibly accomplished lawyer, scholar, author, and activist. So, who better to speak on this issue than him? But he rarely invokes these in his speech, even though these are what we would typically look out for when establishing the ethos or credibility of an argument. So the question that I want us to think of is why not mention them more? Why not begin your speech by saying, this is who I am, and then making your argument and just expecting us to believe you because of your credentials? Instead, this is his main argument, the power of identity. I believe that our identity is at risk, he says, that when we actually don't care about these difficult things, the positive and wonderful things are nonetheless implicated, that we don't, as a nation and as individuals within this nation, talk about our problems, and that because of that, we can't really understand what has happened and what it means that we have done these things, etc. And he ends with, I believe that many of you understand that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice, that we cannot be full, evolved human beings until we care about human rights and basic dignity, that all of our survival is tied to the survival of everyone, that our visions of technology and design and entertainment and creativity have to be married with our visions of humanity, compassion, and injustice. So, because ethos is established in a variety of ways and does not simply focus on statistics and data and unbiased research, which we've learned doesn't exist, Stevenson wants to create this argument that extends beyond the fact that this issue exists, because it does. He wants to persuade us to be invested in that issue, to care about that issue, to understand our place in that issue, and to persuade us to do something about it and to be actively involved in this work that he's doing. So Stevenson's ethos could be situated, i.e., if he told us all of this from the very beginning, then his ethos would be situated. In other words, his credibility would already exist in this argument, but instead it's invented. So because he doesn't rely on all of his credentials or the research that he's done, and instead approaches ethos by invoking virtue and goodwill and practical wisdom into his argument, using personal experience, using connecting with his audience, using those three appeals, he invents his credibility and his ethos, and along the way convinces us that we should care about this issue and that we should trust him. So these are some questions to consider. You can pause the video if you would like to ponder these. But I really want to move on to the conclusion or the so what of this lesson. So my question was, has your understanding of ethos changed at all after watching Stevenson's talk and having this discussion and doing your discussion board posts? And hopefully, while this is a lot to take in, it has changed your understanding of ethos for the better, and that it gave you a lot of freedom and agency to approach establishing ethos in your arguments in a way that's more authentic to you and your experiences and passions and your identity. So when you have your list of sources from your annotated bib and you're making your outlines and you're having to figure out where to fill in the blanks and establish your argument and insert your voice, I want you to think about ethos in a way that can be independent of your sources and can really rely on how you as a writer are going to establish ethos for yourself and for your argument in general. So this will also hopefully help you address the question I left on many of your annotated bibliographies and proposals. If you haven't looked at that feedback yet, make sure you do, which is how will you answer the so what question? So in your proposals, a lot of you have explicitly stated how all of the research that you've done is going to defend your stance on this topic, but a huge chunk of your argument is the so what. So Stevenson's whole TED Talk is essentially the answer to this question. It's not focused on the research that defends that the United States' prison system is systematically racist and it promotes injustice, but instead it's really focused on the why his audience should care about it and what we should do. So I want you to take from this thinking about that. How will you answer the so what question of your argument? How will you justify your stance on an issue and connect with your audience and convince them to care about it? And do so in a way that establishes the ethos of your argument. So that's all I have for you today. If you have any questions, as always, don't hesitate to reach out. And don't forget that your ILP 5 is due this Sunday, March 14th by 11:59 p.m.